Marcus Chen never thought a traffic jam would make him the most hated man in Riverside Heights. But then again, he never thought 30 protesters would block emergency vehicles while his neighbor's house burned down behind them. It started like any other Tuesday morning in September. Marcus, 38 and recently appointed as emergency response coordinator for the city fire department, was reviewing dispatch protocols in his office when the first call came in. House fire on Elm Street. Thick smoke visible from 3 blocks away. Standard response. Engine 12 would handle it. Maybe Engine 15 for backup if needed. What wasn't standard was the second call. 3 minutes later. Engine 12 to dispatch. We got a problem. Maple Street is completely blocked by protesters. Can't get through. Marcus grabbed his radio and headed for his vehicle. Maple Street was the main artery into the Riverside Heights neighborhood, where he'd moved just 6 months earlier. It was an affluent area known for 2 things: beautiful tree-lined streets and frequent activism. Environmental protests, social justice rallies, anti-development demonstrations. The residents of Riverside Heights wore their civic engagement like a badge of honor. Marcus had lost his previous emergency management job in Springfield when budget cuts eliminated his position. This role in Riverside Heights was supposed to be his fresh start, a chance to rebuild after a career setback that had shaken his confidence. He lived there now with his 16-year-old daughter, Emma, who was still struggling to fit in at her new school and resented the move that had torn her away from her friends. As Marcus drove toward the scene, he could see the smoke rising in the distance. Black, thick smoke that meant the fire was growing. Every minute counted in a house fire, the difference between property damage and total loss, between escape and tragedy. He reached the protest site on Maple Street and immediately understood the problem. About 30 people sat linked arm in arm across the entire width of the street, blocking all traffic. Their signs read, "Stop the development, save our green spaces, and no more concrete." Engine 12 sat idling about 50 yards away, its red lights flashing uselessly. Marcus approached the group's apparent leader, a well-dressed woman in her early 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive athleisure wear. She was speaking into a megaphone, rallying her supporters about the proposed shopping complex that would destroy the last undeveloped lot in their neighborhood. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, showing his department identification. "I'm Marcus Chen, Emergency Response Coordinator. We have an active house fire on Elm Street. This fire truck needs to get through immediately." The woman lowered her megaphone and fixed him with a steady gaze. "I'm Diana Westbrook, and we're exercising our constitutional right to peaceful protest. This development will destroy our community's character and harm the environment. Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but there's a house on fire right now. People could be in danger." Diana glanced toward the smoke visible above the trees, then back at Marcus with what seemed like genuine indifference. "Property damage is unfortunate, but it's less important than stopping the environmental destruction this development will cause. We've been fighting this for months through proper channels, and now we're taking direct action. Mrs. Westbrook, this fire truck needs to get through now. Every minute of delay increases the risk of the fire spreading to neighboring homes." "We're not moving," Diana replied firmly. "This is bigger than one house. We're fighting for the future of our entire community." Marcus felt his jaw clench. In his military logistics training and years in emergency management, he learned that every crisis had multiple solutions, but only if people were willing to be reasonable. This woman wasn't interested in reason. "Can you at least move your protest to the sidewalk so emergency vehicles can pass?" Absolutely not. The effectiveness of civil disobedience depends on creating meaningful disruption. Moving to the sidewalk would defeat the purpose. Behind Diana, several protesters nodded in agreement. Marcus noticed they all looked comfortable, well-fed, the kind of people who had never waited for an ambulance or watched their neighborhood burn while help sat stuck in traffic. Marcus radioed for Engine 15 to try the alternate route through Oak Valley Road, but that would add at least 8 more minutes to their response time. In a house fire, 8 minutes was an eternity. 12 minutes after the initial call, Engine 12 finally reached the scene by backing up and taking a circuitous route that added 4 blocks to their journey. By then, The fire had spread from the kitchen where it started to the entire first floor of Mrs. Patterson's house. The elderly woman was found unconscious from smoke inhalation and rushed to the hospital. When local news crews arrived to cover the protest, they found a very different story than Diana had anticipated. Instead of sympathetic coverage of environmental activism, they filmed fire trucks blocked by protesters while smoke billowed in the background. Mrs. Patterson's neighbors spoke tearfully about the woman who had lived on Elm Street for 40 years, who baked cookies for every new family that moved in, who was now fighting for her life because help had been delayed. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as the department spokesman. "Emergency response time is critical in every situation," he told the reporter. "When protests block emergency vehicles, it's not just property at stake, it's lives." Diana defended her group's actions to the same news crew. "We sympathize with Mrs. Patterson, but we can't let one unfortunate incident derail our fight against environmental destruction. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good." That soundbite would come back to haunt her. Standing in Mrs. Patterson's driveway that evening, watching the family assess the damage that could have been prevented, Marcus made a decision. He'd spent his career working within systems, following protocols, trusting that reasonable people would eventually do reasonable things. But Diana Westbrook and her protesters weren't reasonable people. They were wealthy activists playing games with other people's safety. It was time to change the rules of the game. The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop, determined to understand exactly what he was dealing with. Emma had already left for school, muttering something about a history test she hadn't studied for. The house felt too quiet, too empty, a reminder that it still didn't feel like home 6 months after their move. He started with a simple Google search, Diana Westbrook, Riverside Heights. What he found was illuminating. Diana Westbrook wasn't just some passionate citizen who'd gotten carried away with environmental activism. She was the founder and president of Riverside Environmental Action, a well-funded organization that had been staging protests throughout the city for the past 5 years. Her LinkedIn profile showed no traditional employment history. Instead, it listed her as a full-time environmental and social justice advocate. Marcus dug deeper. Property records showed Diana owned a $1.8 million home in the most exclusive part of Riverside Heights, inherited from her parents along with what appeared to be a substantial trust fund. Her father had been a prominent attorney, her mother a city council member in the 1980s. Diana had never held a traditional job, never worried about missing work to attend protests, never faced the financial consequences that most people would face for getting arrested. The Riverside Environmental Action website painted a picture of grassroots activism, but the financial disclosures told a different story. The organization was funded almost entirely by the Westbrook Family Foundation, with Diana as both the primary donor and the sole decision-maker for how funds were used. In the past year alone, REA had received over $300,000 in donations, money that paid for professional-grade protest equipment, legal fees, and what appeared to be stipends for regular protesters. Marcus cross-referenced news articles about REA's activities over the past 5 years. The pattern was disturbing. They had blocked roads during rush hour to protest a new highway exchange, delaying commuters for hours. They had staged sit-ins at construction sites, forcing delays in affordable housing projects. They had chained themselves to city buses to protest route changes, stranding working-class riders who depended on public transportation. Most tellingly, REA consistently targeted projects in working-class neighborhoods while avoiding protests that might inconvenience the wealthy residents of areas like Riverside Heights. The highway exchange they protested would have provided better access for residents of the East Side, where Marcus had noticed the demographics were notably more diverse and economically mixed. The affordable housing they blocked was planned for an area where minimum wage workers could actually afford to live. At 9 a.m., Marcus called the fire department's records office. "Hi, this is Marcus Chen from Emergency Response. I need to pull incident reports for any delays caused by protests or demonstrations over the past 2 years." The clerk, a woman named Betty who'd been with the department for 20 years, sighed audibly. "Oh, honey, you're going to need a bigger file cabinet. That Westbrook woman and her group have been a nightmare for emergency services. How many incidents are we talking about? Let me pull the reports. Okay, here we go. In the past 2 years, we've documented 17 separate incidents where REA protests caused delays to emergency vehicles. Ambulances, fire trucks, police responding to domestic violence calls. The longest delay was 26 minutes when they blocked the entire downtown corridor during their anti-gentrification protest. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. 26 minutes? What was the emergency? House fire with a family trapped on the second floor. Thank God we got there in time, but it was close. Real close. After hanging up, Marcus decided to visit Mrs. Patterson in the hospital. The elderly woman was awake but weak, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. Her son Robert was there, a tired-looking man in his 50s who worked as a civil rights attorney. How was she doing? Marcus asked. Robert shook his head. The doctors say the smoke damage to her lungs is significant. She'll recover, but it's going to take months. And the house. He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. The insurance adjuster said if the fire department had arrived, even 5 minutes earlier, the damage would have been contained to just the kitchen. As it is, she's lost almost everything on the first floor. I'm sorry. I tried to get them to move. I know you did. I heard about it on the news. Robert looked at his mother, who was sleeping fitfully. You know what's really getting to me? I've spent my whole career fighting for social justice, representing people who don't have a voice. I believe in the right to protest. But this, he gestured helplessly. This isn't justice. This is privilege dressed up as activism. That afternoon, Marcus drove through the neighborhood where Diana lived. The streets were pristine, lined with mature oak trees and houses that looked like they belonged in architectural magazines. He passed a small park where a bronze plaque indicated it had been preserved through the dedicated activism of the Westbrook family. The irony wasn't lost on him. Diana's family had successfully protected their own green space while her current protests blocked projects that would provide similar amenities to less affluent areas. He stopped at a coffee shop near Diana's house and struck up a conversation with the barista, a college-aged woman with purple hair and multiple piercings. Oh, you mean Diana? The girl said when Marcus casually mentioned seeing protests on the news. Yeah, she comes in here all the time. Always talking about fighting the system and protecting the environment. It's kind of funny, though. She drives this huge SUV and always orders drinks with like 4 shots of espresso in disposable cups. What do you mean, funny? Well, she's always going on about corporate waste and environmental destruction, but she generates more trash in a week than most people do in a month. And that SUV of hers? I've seen her drive it 2 blocks to the grocery store. Marcus bought his coffee and sat in his car, processing what he'd learned. Diana Westbrook wasn't a passionate activist driven by principle. She was a wealthy woman playing at revolution, using other people's money to fund protests that primarily inconvenienced the working class while leaving her own comfortable lifestyle untouched. As he drove home, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad, can you pick me up after school? Some kids are being weird about the fire thing. The personal was becoming political, and Marcus realized that Diana's next move would probably target him directly. Marcus arrived at Jefferson High School 20 minutes early, wanting to observe the situation before picking up Emma. What he saw in a student parking lot made his blood run cold. A small group of protesters, maybe 8 or 10 people, stood near the school entrance holding signs that read, "Stop Fire Department Harassment," and "Emergency Services equals Police State." Diana Westbrook stood in the center of the group, speaking to a local news camera. We're here to support the young people who understand that challenging authority is how change happens. The fire department's attack on our constitutional rights cannot go unanswered. Marcus parked across the street and called Emma. Hey, sweetheart, I'm here early. Where are you? Dad, don't come to the main entrance. There are protesters here, and they're asking students about you. I'm at the side door by the gym. As Marcus drove around to the gym entrance, he spotted Emma waiting with 2 other students. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped in a way that reminded him painfully of the months after her mother died. Thanks for coming early, Emma said as she got in the car. This is getting really weird. What happened today? Some kids in my AP government class started asking me about the protest thing. At first I thought they were just curious, but then this girl, Sarah, her mom is friends with that Diana woman. She started saying you were trying to silence people who speak truth to power. Emma's voice cracked slightly. Dad, I don't even know what that means. Marcus felt a surge of anger that Diana would drag his daughter into this conflict, but he kept his voice calm. It means some adults don't know the difference between speaking truth and endangering lives. That evening, Marcus received a call from his supervisor, Fire Chief Patricia Rodriguez. Marcus, I need you to know that we've gotten several complaints about your handling of the Maple Street incident. Someone filed a formal grievance claiming you were hostile to peaceful protesters. Chief, I was trying to get emergency vehicles through to a house fire. I know that, and you know that, but there are political pressures here. The mayor's office has been getting calls from Diana Westbrook and her supporters. They're claiming the fire department is being used to suppress free speech. Marcus stared out his kitchen window toward the distant lights of downtown. What are you saying? I'm saying be careful, document everything, and maybe consider keeping a lower profile for a while. The next morning brought a new escalation. Marcus's usual route to work took him down Maple Street, but when he reached the intersection, he found it blocked again. This time, the protest was larger, maybe 40 people, and their signs had a decidedly personal edge. Marcus Chen, corporate tool, and fire department lies about emergency response. Diana stood in the center of the group with her megaphone. When she saw Marcus's car, she pointed directly at him. There he is, the man who thinks emergency services should have the right to trample on our constitutional freedoms. Marcus rolled down his window. Ms. Westbrook, I need to get to work. So do the slaves need to get to the fields? Diana shouted back. But sometimes disrupting normal routines is how we create change. The comparison was so absurd, so offensive, that Marcus almost laughed. Instead, he took out his phone and started recording. This is Marcus Chen, 7:45 a.m., October 3rd. Protesters are blocking Maple Street, preventing city employees from reaching work locations. Document all you want, Diana called out. We're not intimidated by surveillance tactics. Marcus had to take a detour that added 15 minutes to his commute, making him late for a department meeting on response protocols. When he arrived, Chief Rodriguez was waiting with a grim expression. We need to talk, she said, leading him to her office. I just got off the phone with the mayor. Diana Westbrook is claiming you're using your position to target her organization for political retaliation. Political retaliation? Chief, they're blocking roads where emergency vehicles need to travel. I understand that. But she's smart. She's framing this as a civil rights issue. She's got the ACLU asking questions, and several city council members are demanding an investigation into whether the fire department is exceeding its authority. That afternoon, Marcus was reviewing emergency response maps when Betty from Records knocked on his door. Marcus, you need to see this. She handed him a printout of incident reports. 3 more delays this week. 2 ambulance calls and a police response to a domestic violence situation. Marcus scanned the reports. Each incident involved REA protesters blocking streets at different locations around the city. The domestic violence call was particularly troubling. Police had been delayed 8 minutes responding to a woman whose ex-husband was violating a restraining order. Betty, this pattern is escalating. They're not just blocking random streets anymore. No, they're being strategic about it. Look at the locations. She pointed to a map where she'd marked each incident. They're hitting intersections that emergency services use most frequently. That evening, Marcus was helping Emma with homework when his phone rang. It was Robert Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son. Marcus, I wanted to let you know that my mother had another setback today. Her lung function isn't improving as quickly as the doctors hoped. Robert's voice was strained. They're saying the smoke inhalation was more severe than they initially thought. I'm sorry to hear that. How can I help? Actually, I've been thinking about what we discussed at the hospital, about this Diana Westbrook situation. I've done some research into her organization, and I think you need to know something. Robert paused, and Marcus could hear papers rustling in the background. REA has been involved in blocking emergency services for years, but it's always been in neighborhoods where people don't have the resources to fight back legally. Working-class areas, communities of color, places where people are more worried about paying rent than filing lawsuits against activists. What are you saying? I'm saying she's been getting away with this because her victims can't afford to challenge her. But this time is different. This time she hurt someone whose son happens to be a civil rights attorney with access to resources and legal connections. Marcus felt a spark of hope. Are you thinking about taking legal action? I'm thinking about a lot of things. But first, I want to understand exactly how systematic this pattern has been. Would you be willing to help me document every incident where REA protests have delayed emergency services? As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that Diana Westbrook had made a critical miscalculation. She'd spent years targeting people who couldn't fight back, and now she'd picked a fight with someone who could. Marcus spent the weekend creating what he privately called his war room, the spare bedroom that had been collecting boxes since their move. He cleared out the clutter and set up a desk with his laptop, a printer, and a large wall map of the city marked with colored pins representing every incident where REA protests had delayed emergency services. Robert Patterson had agreed to meet Sunday afternoon to review the documentation they'd been gathering. When he arrived, he brought a briefcase full of legal documents and the focused intensity that Marcus imagined he brought to his most important cases. "Before we start," Robert said, settling into the desk chair Marcus had borrowed from the kitchen, "I want you to understand what we're dealing with legally. Diana Westbrook isn't just some amateur activist who got carried away. She's been very careful to stay within the technical boundaries of legal protest while maximizing the disruption she causes." Marcus pointed to the map on the wall. 23 incidents in 2 years where REA protests delayed emergency vehicles. The average delay is 11 minutes. That's the key word, delay, not prevent. Diane is smart enough never to completely block emergency access for extended periods. She lets them through eventually, but only after causing maximum disruption. Robert pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I've been reviewing permit applications, and REA is meticulous about obtaining protest permits. The problem is they consistently exceed the scope of what their permits allow." "What do you mean?" "Here's an example." Robert spread several papers on the desk. Last month's anti-development protest. Their permit was for a stationary demonstration on the sidewalk in front of City Hall. But the actual protest involved blocking 3 city blocks and preventing vehicle access to the municipal complex for 4 hours. Marcus studied the documents. So they get permits for small-scale demonstrations, then escalate them into major disruptions? Exactly. And when challenged, they claim the escalation was spontaneous, a natural response to community passion. It's very difficult to prosecute because technically they start within legal boundaries. Robert pulled out another set of papers. But here's where it gets interesting. I've been looking into the Westbrook Family Foundation that funds REA. They're required to file annual reports with the IRS about their charitable activities. And the reports describe REA's activities as educational outreach and community engagement. There's no mention of blocking emergency services or causing traffic delays. If we can demonstrate that the foundation is misrepresenting its activities to maintain tax-exempt status, that opens up federal tax fraud issues. Marcus felt a surge of excitement. This was the kind of systematic vulnerability he'd been trained to identify in his military logistics work. What would we need to prove that? Documentation. Lots of it. Every incident, every delay, every permit violation. We need to build a pattern that shows deliberate misrepresentation. Over the next 2 hours, they created a comprehensive database. Marcus provided the emergency services incident reports, while Robert contributed permit applications, insurance filings, and financial documents he'd obtained through public records requests. The pattern that emerged was damning. REA consistently applied for permits allowing small gatherings on sidewalks or in designated protest areas, then executed large-scale street blockades. They claimed to be focused on environmental education, but their activities primarily disrupted working-class communities while avoiding areas where wealthy donors lived. "Look at this," Robert said, highlighting a section of REA's IRS filing. They claim to have conducted 43 educational workshops last year, but I can't find any documentation of actual educational content. No curricula, no attendance records, no learning objectives. Marcus was studying a detailed timeline they'd created when his phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, can you come get me? Something happened." "What's wrong?" he texted back. "I'll explain when you get here. I'm at McDonald's on 5th Street. Marcus found Emma sitting alone in a back booth, her face streaked with tears. When she saw him, she started crying harder. "Sweetheart, what happened?" "Some kids from school were at the mall today. When they saw me, they started following me around, making comments about how my dad hates protesters and free speech." Emma wiped her nose with a napkin. Then this older woman, I think she was someone's mom, came up to me and started asking if I was proud of having a father who attacks people for standing up for their beliefs. Marcus felt his jaw clench. "Did she tell you her name?" "Sarah said it was her mom. You know, the girl from my government class whose mom is friends with that Diana woman." "What did you tell her?" "I said my dad saves lives, and she should leave me alone. But then she said," Emma's voice broke. "She said that people like you are the reason the world is falling apart, and that I should be ashamed." Marcus reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully. What these people are doing isn't about saving the world or fighting injustice. It's about power and control. They're targeting you because they want to hurt me, and that tells you everything you need to know about their character. But what if they're right? What if I don't understand the bigger picture?" The bigger picture is that Mrs. Patterson almost died because Diana Westbrook decided her political theater was more important than letting fire trucks through. The bigger picture is that they're willing to use a 16-year-old girl to fight their adult battles. On the drive home, Marcus made a decision. Diana Westbrook had crossed a line by involving his daughter. It was time to stop playing defense and start leveraging his professional expertise. That evening, Marcus called his former supervisor from Springfield, Captain James Morrison. "Jim, I need a favor. I'm dealing with a situation where activists are systematically blocking emergency services, and I need to understand federal regulations about interfering with emergency responders." "That's pretty specific, Marcus. What kind of interference are we talking about?" Marcus explained the situation with REA and Diana Westbrook. Jim listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing and scope. "Okay, here's what you need to know," Jim said finally. "There are federal statutes about interfering with emergency services, especially if there's a pattern of behavior that suggests intentional disruption. The key is demonstrating that the interference isn't incidental to legitimate protest, but is actually part of the protest strategy. How do we prove intent? Documentation, timing, and pattern recognition. If you can show that they're consistently targeting emergency routes and timing their protests to maximize disruption during peak response hours, that suggests deliberate interference rather than coincidental conflict." Jim paused, and Marcus could hear him typing in the background. "There's something else. If emergency services delays result in serious injury or property damage, and if those delays are caused by deliberate interference, there are potential federal civil rights violations involved." Civil rights violations? The right to emergency services is considered a fundamental civil right. If someone is systematically denying that right to specific communities, especially if there's any evidence of discriminatory targeting, that brings federal civil rights law into play. Marcus thought about the map on his wall, with its clear pattern of protests concentrated in working-class neighborhoods, while avoiding areas where Diana and her supporters lived. "Jim, what if I told you the targeting appears to be systematically focused on lower-income and minority communities? Then you'd be looking at a potential federal civil rights investigation." "Marcus, if you're documenting what I think you're documenting, this is bigger than local politics. This could be a federal case." After hanging up, Marcus returned to his war room and stared at the map of incident locations. For the first time since this whole situation began, he felt like he had a real strategy rather than just reactive tactics. Diana Westbrook had built her protest empire by targeting people who couldn't fight back. But she made the mistake of assuming Marcus Chen was just another local bureaucrat who would be intimidated by political pressure and media attention. She was about to learn the difference between a bureaucrat and a strategist. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Marcus's office. Special Agent Sarah Kim from the FBI's Civil Rights Division stood in his doorway, holding a manila folder and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. Mr. Chen, I understand you've been documenting incidents involving the Riverside Environmental Action Group and emergency services delays. Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. Yes, along with Robert Patterson, whose mother was injured in the house fire. How did you hear about our documentation? Your former supervisor, Captain Morrison, forwarded some information to our office. We've been monitoring REA's activities as part of a broader investigation into civil rights violations involving discriminatory targeting of emergency services. Agent Kim opened her folder and spread several documents on Marcus's desk. What we're seeing here fits a pattern we've identified in 3 other cities. Activist groups using protest tactics specifically designed to deny emergency services to working-class and minority communities while avoiding disruption in affluent areas. Marcus studied the documents. They showed maps similar to what he and Robert had created, but covering cities in Oregon, Colorado, and Michigan. In each case, the pattern was identical. Protests concentrated in areas with higher concentrations of minority residents and lower average incomes. Is this coordinated? Marcus asked. We're investigating that possibility. Diana Westbrook has attended conferences and training sessions with organizers from these other cities. There's evidence of shared strategies and what appears to be a deliberate methodology for targeting communities with limited political resources to fight back. Agent Kim pulled out another document. This is where your documentation becomes crucial. We need detailed evidence of the pattern here in your city, including timing, locations, and impacts on emergency response. Your incident reports, combined with Mr. Patterson's permit violation research, could be the foundation for federal civil rights charges. Over the next hour, Agent Kim explained the legal framework they were building. The Civil Rights Act included provisions protecting access to essential services, and emergency response qualified as an essential service. If they could prove that REA was systematically denying emergency access to specific communities based on demographic characteristics, it constituted federal civil rights violations. The challenge, Agent Kim explained, is proving intent. Diana Westbrook is sophisticated enough to claim her protest locations are chosen for maximum visibility and impact, not demographic targeting. We need evidence that she's deliberately avoiding certain areas while concentrating on others. Marcus thought about Diana's beautiful neighborhood with its preserved green spaces and pristine streets that had never seen a single REA protest. What kind of evidence would prove that? Internal communications, strategic planning documents, anything that shows the decision-making process behind protest locations. Also, we need victims willing to testify about the impact of delayed emergency services. That afternoon, Marcus met with Robert Patterson and 3 other families affected by REA-caused delays. The group included Maria Santos, whose diabetic son had suffered complications when an ambulance was delayed 12 minutes during a severe hypoglycemic episode, David Kim, whose house fire damage had spread to neighboring properties due to extended response times, and Janet Williams, a single mother whose call about domestic violence had been delayed when police couldn't reach her apartment complex. The FBI agent explained that we need to establish a pattern of harm, Robert told the group. Each of your cases demonstrates how these delays have real, measurable consequences for real people. Maria Santos spoke first, her voice shaking with anger. My son could have died. The doctor said if the paramedics had arrived, even 5 minutes later, he might have gone into a coma. And for what? So Diana Westbrook could make a point about some development project that doesn't even affect her neighborhood. Janet Williams nodded grimly. The police officer who finally responded to my domestic violence call told me they'd been delayed by protesters on Riverside Avenue. My ex-husband had already broken down my door by the time they arrived. If my neighbor hadn't called his cousin to come help, I don't know what would have happened. Robert was taking detailed notes. The FBI needs documentation of damages, medical bills, property damage, any costs related to the delayed response. They also need testimony about the long-term impact on your lives. David Kim pulled out a folder thick with insurance documents. My house fire spread to my neighbor's garage and damaged their car. The insurance companies are still fighting about liability, but the fire department's report clearly states that the extended response time contributed to the spread of the fire. Over the next week, Marcus worked closely with Agent Kim to develop a comprehensive case file. They documented 47 separate incidents over 3 years where REA protests had delayed emergency services. The geographic analysis was damning. 89% of the delays occurred in census tracts with median incomes below the city average, while 0 delays had occurred in the affluent neighborhoods where REA's major donors lived. Meanwhile, Diana Westbrook was escalating her campaign against Marcus. She'd started a social media hashtag Marcus Chen oppression, that painted him as a tool of authoritarian government trying to silence grassroots activism. Her supporters were sharing doctored photos that made him look sinister and posting conspiracy theories about his military background. The harassment extended beyond social media. Marcus started finding flyers under his windshield wipers calling him a fascist sympathizer and enemy of free speech. Someone left a bag of dog waste on his front porch with a note reading, "This is what we think of fire department lies." Emma was bearing the brunt of the campaign at school. Students who'd never spoken to her before were approaching her in hallways to express their opinions about her father's attack on civil rights. Her social studies teacher had assigned a project on civil disobedience that seemed designed to put Emma in an uncomfortable position. "Dad, can I transfer schools?" Emma asked over dinner one evening. "This is getting ridiculous. Today, some girl I've never even talked to told me I should be ashamed of having a father who oppresses marginalized communities." Marcus set down his fork. "Emma, I know this is hard, but transferring schools would be letting them win. These people are bullying you because they can't win the argument on facts. But what if they're right? What if I don't understand the bigger issues?" The bigger issue is that Mrs. Patterson almost died. Maria Santos' son almost went into a coma, and Janet Williams was trapped with her abusive ex-husband because Diana Westbrook thinks her political theater is more important than other people's safety. Marcus reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "Standing up to bullies isn't oppression, sweetheart. It's justice." That Friday, Agent Kim called with news that changed everything. "Marcus, we've received some information from a confidential source within REA. Someone who's been documenting internal planning meetings and strategy sessions." "What kind of information?" "The kind that proves intent. Meeting minutes where Diana Westbrook explicitly discusses targeting politically vulnerable communities and avoiding areas where donors and supporters might be inconvenienced. We're talking about smoking gun, evidence of deliberate discriminatory targeting." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. "What's the next step?" "We're preparing to execute search warrants for REA's offices and Diana Westbrook's home. We'll be seizing computers, financial records, and planning documents. Based on what we already have, I'm confident we'll find enough evidence for federal civil rights charges." "When?" "Next week. And Marcus, when this goes public, Diana Westbrook is going to come at you with everything she has. She's going to claim this is political persecution, government overreach, an attack on free speech. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus thought about Mrs. Patterson in the hospital, Emma crying in the McDonald's booth, and all the families who'd suffered because Diana Westbrook treated other people's emergencies as props in her political theater. "Agent Kim, I've been prepared for that since the day she told me property damage was less important than her environmental concerns. Let her come." The morning of November 15th started with an email that made Marcus smile for the first time in weeks. Emma had been accepted to the regional science fair for her project on emergency response systems and community safety. Her work documenting the correlation between protest-related delays and adverse outcomes had impressed the judges, who praised her sophisticated understanding of complex civic issues. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, showing him her phone over breakfast. The science fair coordinator said my project demonstrates exceptional analytical thinking for a high school student. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. You turned a terrible situation into something constructive." "I learned that from watching you," Emma replied. and Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. The moment of family celebration was interrupted by Marcus's work phone ringing. Chief Rodriguez's voice was tense. "Marcus, we've got a situation developing. Diana Westbrook has called a press conference for this afternoon. She's claiming the fire department is colluding with federal authorities to suppress free speech and intimidate activists." "How does she know about the FBI investigation?" "Someone leaked it. My guess is she has sources in City Hall who tipped her off about the federal involvement. She's getting ahead of the story." Marcus arrived at work to find Agent Kim waiting in his office with a laptop and a grim expression. "We've got problems," she said without preamble. "Diana Westbrook somehow learned about our investigation and is mounting a preemptive public relations campaign." She turned the laptop screen toward Marcus. Diana's social media accounts were flooded with posts about federal government persecution of environmental activists and militarized emergency services targeting peaceful protesters. The hashtag FBI overreach was trending locally, with hundreds of supporters sharing stories about government intimidation of civil rights movements. "She's smart," Agent Kim admitted grudgingly. "She's framing this as political persecution before we can present the evidence of civil rights violations. By the time we execute the search warrants, public opinion will already be shaped in her favor." Marcus studied the social media posts. Diana had crafted a narrative that positioned her as a David fighting the government Goliath, with Marcus cast as the vindictive bureaucrat who'd called in federal authorities because he couldn't handle legitimate criticism. "What's our timeline for the search warrants?" "Originally, we planned to execute them Friday. But given this public relations offensive, my supervisors are considering accelerating the timeline. The longer we wait, the more opportunity she has to destroy evidence and build public sympathy." That afternoon, Diana's press conference played out exactly as Marcus had feared. She stood in front of REA's office, surrounded by supporters, families with children, and several sympathetic city council members. Her message was carefully crafted to sound reasonable and principled. "For months, Marcus, Chen, and the fire department have been building a case against our organization for exercising our constitutional right to peaceful protest," Diana told the assembled reporters. "Now we've learned that he's enlisted federal authorities in what amounts to political persecution of environmental activists." A reporter asked about the emergency services delays. Diana's response was smooth and well-rehearsed. "Emergency services have never been prevented from reaching their destinations. Yes, there have been brief delays while we exercised our First Amendment rights, but the fire department's own records show that response times in our city are better than national averages. This is a manufactured crisis designed to silence legitimate environmental advocacy." Marcus watched the press conference from his office, noting how Diana carefully avoided mentioning specific victims like Mrs. Patterson or Maria Santos' son. She was presenting the issue in abstract terms that avoided the human cost of her actions. The most damaging moment came when Diana was asked about the federal investigation. Her response sent a chill through Marcus. "The FBI's involvement represents a dangerous escalation in the government's war on environmental activism. Marcus Chen couldn't silence us through normal channels, so he's weaponized federal law enforcement against peaceful protesters. This is exactly the kind of government overreach that threatens all of our civil liberties." By evening, Diana's narrative had gained significant traction. Local social media was flooded with posts supporting REA and condemning what people were calling federal intimidation tactics. Several city council members issued statements expressing concern about FBI involvement in local political disputes. Marcus's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters seeking comment. On the advice of Agent Kim and Chief Rodriguez, he declined all interviews, which unfortunately allowed Diana's version of events to dominate the news cycle. The personal attacks intensified dramatically. Someone spray-painted "fascist" on Marcus's garage door overnight. Emma found hostile notes in her school locker calling her father a government stooge and enemy of the people. The harassment was becoming systematic and coordinated. "Dad, I'm scared," Emma confided that evening as they cleaned the paint off the garage door. "Some of the kids at school are acting really aggressive about this whole thing. Today, someone shoved me in the hallway and said their parents told them I was part of a family that destroys democracy. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but kept his voice calm. Emma, what these people are doing isn't democracy. Democracy is following laws, respecting other people's rights, and accepting consequences for your actions. What Diana Westbrook is doing is using mob tactics to intimidate anyone who challenges her. But what if the FBI thing makes it worse? What if people think we're really trying to silence free speech? The FBI isn't investigating REA because of their political views, sweetheart. They're investigating because Diana Westbrook has been systematically denying emergency services to minority and working-class communities. That's not free speech. That's discrimination disguised as activism. The next morning brought unexpected developments on multiple fronts. Agent Kim called at 6 a.m. with urgent news. Marcus, our confidential source within REA, has provided us with something significant. Diana Westbrook held an emergency strategy meeting last night to discuss managing the federal situation. Our source recorded the entire meeting. What did she say? Things that prove everything we suspected about her true motivations. She explicitly discussed how to maintain public sympathy while eliminating evidence of targeting strategies. She also talked about accelerating plans to neutralize Marcus Chen's credibility through systematic community pressure. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. What does that mean for the timeline? We're executing search warrants tomorrow morning. We can't wait any longer. She's actively working to destroy evidence and escalate harassment against you and your family. An hour later, Chief Rodriguez called with more news. Marcus, the mayor wants to meet with you this afternoon. Apparently, several major donors to Diana's organization have been calling City Hall expressing concern about federal overreach. Donors who live in neighborhoods that have never experienced REA protests. Exactly. The mayor is feeling political pressure from people who support Diana's cause, but are suddenly worried about FBI investigations in their city. That afternoon's meeting at City Hall was tense. Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a career politician who'd managed to avoid taking strong positions on controversial issues for 2 decades, looked deeply uncomfortable as she addressed Marcus across her conference table. Mr. Chen, I want to understand exactly how we got to the point where federal authorities are investigating local environmental activists. Some very prominent citizens are concerned that this situation has escalated beyond what was necessary. Marcus had prepared for this conversation. Madam Mayor, the FBI contacted us after identifying a pattern of civil rights violations involving discriminatory denial of emergency services. This isn't about environmental activism. It's about systematic targeting of vulnerable communities. But surely this could have been resolved through local channels? Local channels don't work when the person causing the problem has political connections that prevent accountability. Mrs. Patterson almost died, Mayor Hendricks. Maria Santos's child almost went into a diabetic coma. How many people need to be hurt before we acknowledge that blocking emergency vehicles isn't legitimate protest? The mayor's discomfort was evident. She'd built her career on avoiding difficult decisions, and now she was caught between federal authorities investigating civil rights violations and wealthy donors who supported Diana's organization. I'm not questioning your motives, Mr. Chen, but the optics of this situation are concerning. It looks like the city is using federal authorities to silence political opposition. Marcus leaned forward. Madam Mayor, tomorrow you're going to see evidence that Diana Westbrook has been deliberately targeting minority and working-class communities while avoiding areas where her supporters live. When that evidence becomes public, you'll need to decide whether you want to be remembered as someone who enabled discrimination or someone who supported equal protection under the law. As he left City Hall, Marcus realized that everything was coming to a head. Tomorrow's search warrants would either vindicate his actions or destroy his career. Diana Westbrook was mounting an increasingly desperate campaign to frame herself as a victim of government persecution. The entire community was choosing sides. But Marcus had learned something important in his military training. When you're fighting for the right cause with solid evidence and clear purpose, the chaos of battle eventually resolves in favor of truth. Tomorrow would prove whether that principle held in civilian life. At 6:47 a.m. on November 16th, Marcus was drinking coffee and reviewing Emma's science fair presentation when his phone buzzed with a text from Agent Kim. It's happening. Stay available. 3 miles away, a convoy of unmarked federal vehicles was pulling up to the offices of Riverside Environmental Action. Agent Kim had assembled a team of 12 FBI agents, 2 computer forensic specialists, and a federal prosecutor to execute simultaneous search warrants at REA's headquarters and Diana Westbrook's home. Marcus drove to work earlier than usual, knowing that once news of the raids broke, his phone would be ringing constantly. He'd barely settled at his desk when Chief Rodriguez appeared in his doorway with an expression that mixed excitement and apprehension. "It's all over social media," she said, handing him her phone. Diana Westbrook is live-streaming federal agents searching her house. She's calling it a fascist assault on democracy. Marcus watched the live stream with fascination. Diana stood in her pristine kitchen, carefully positioned so viewers could see FBI agents boxing up documents in the background, speaking in measured tones about government persecution of environmental activists. "This is what happens when you challenge corporate power in America," Diana told her phone camera. "They send armed federal agents to intimidate you in your own home. But we will not be silenced." What Diana's viewers couldn't see, but Marcus knew from Agent Kim's briefing, was that the search warrant was specifically focused on documents related to protest planning, financial records from the Westbrook Foundation, and any communications discussing the targeting of specific communities or demographic groups. At 8:15 a.m., Marcus's phone rang. It was Robert Patterson, and his voice carried barely contained excitement. "Marcus, turn on Channel 7 News. They're interviewing the FBI spokesperson about the raids." Marcus switched to the local news channel, where Special Agent Kim was standing in front of REA's office addressing a crowd of reporters. Her statement was brief but devastating. "Today's search warrants are part of an ongoing federal civil rights investigation into systematic denial of emergency services to specific communities based on racial and economic demographics. We have evidence suggesting that protest activities were deliberately planned to target minority and working-class neighborhoods while avoiding disruption in affluent areas." The reporter's follow-up question was immediate. "Agent Kim, are you saying this environmental group was engaging in racial discrimination?" "I'm saying that our investigation has identified a pattern of behavior that appears to violate federal civil rights laws protecting equal access to emergency services. The evidence we're collecting today will help determine whether criminal charges are appropriate." Marcus's phone exploded with calls from reporters, city officials, and colleagues. He declined all interviews, following Agent Kim's advice to let the evidence speak for itself. But he couldn't resist checking social media, where Diana's supporters were rallying with hashtags like #FBI Overreach and #DefendDiana. The narrative battle was fierce. Diana's live stream had been viewed over 50,000 times, and her supporters were sharing it widely with captions about government persecution of activists. But the FBI's statement about civil rights violations was also gaining traction, particularly among community members who had experienced REA-related delays. At 10:30 a.m., Maria Santos called Marcus. "I just saw the news about the FBI raids. Does this mean something might actually happen to her?" "I can't speak for the FBI investigation, but I can tell you they don't execute federal search warrants unless they have substantial evidence of criminal activity." "Good," Maria said firmly. "My son still has nightmares about his diabetic episode. He's afraid to be alone because he's worried an ambulance won't be able to reach him if something happens again." The morning's developments took an unexpected turn when Janet Williams, the domestic violence victim whose police response had been delayed, appeared at a hastily organized press conference outside City Hall. She was flanked by Robert Patterson and 2 other victims of REA-related delays. "I want people to understand what Diana Westbrook's protests really cost," Janet told the assembled reporters. "When police couldn't reach my apartment because protesters were blocking the streets, I was trapped with my violent ex-husband for an extra 8 minutes. 8 minutes might not sound like much, but when someone is threatening to kill you, Every second feels like an hour. Robert Patterson stepped forward with a folder of documents. The FBI investigation isn't about suppressing free speech or environmental activism. It's about accountability for a pattern of behavior that systematically denied emergency services to working-class communities and communities of color. He held up a map showing protest locations overlaid with demographic data. 89% of REA protests that delayed emergency services occurred in census tracts with below-average incomes and higher concentrations of minority residents. 0% occurred in the affluent neighborhoods where Diana Westbrook and her major donors live. The visual impact of the map was immediate and powerful. Even reporters who had been sympathetic to Diana's claims about government overreach began asking harder questions about the targeting patterns. Meanwhile, the FBI search was yielding exactly the kind of evidence Agent Kim had hoped to find. Marcus received updates throughout the day as agents discovered internal REA documents that discussed strategic community targeting and maximizing impact in politically vulnerable areas. The most damaging discovery came from Diana's personal computer. Email exchanges with protest organizers in other cities discussing tactics for focusing disruption on working-class neighborhoods where residents lack resources to mount legal challenges. At 2 p.m., Agent Kim called Marcus with an update that changed everything. "We found the smoking gun. Diana has been keeping detailed spreadsheets tracking the demographics of neighborhoods where they stage protests. Income levels, racial composition, political voting patterns, even data on how many residents have college degrees. She was literally targeting communities based on their ability to fight back. Worse than that, we found emails where she instructs other organizers to avoid protests in areas where donors and supporters might be inconvenienced. She's been running a two-tier activism system, maximizing disruption for working-class communities while protecting wealthy neighborhoods." The afternoon brought another wave of media attention as news of the seized evidence began to leak. Diana's live stream had evolved from triumphant defiance to increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her narrative of persecution. "They're trying to criminalize environmental activism," Diana told her viewers, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "They're taking my personal files, my computer, even my calendar. This is what a police state looks like." What Diana didn't know was that Agent Kim's team had also discovered financial records showing that the Westbrook Foundation had been claiming tax deductions for educational outreach and community engagement, while funding activities that deliberately targeted specific communities for disruption. By evening, the story had gained national attention. CNN was running segments about environmental activism and civil rights, while Fox News was covering federal overreach in local politics. The story was being interpreted through different political lenses, but the core facts were becoming undeniable. Marcus spent the evening helping Emma prepare for her science fair presentation, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy amid the chaos. But as they reviewed her charts showing the correlation between protest locations and emergency response delays, he realized that his daughter had independently discovered much of the same pattern that the FBI was now investigating. "Dad," Emma said as they finished reviewing her presentation, "do you think this will actually stop her from hurting more people?" Marcus thought about Mrs. Patterson, still recovering from smoke inhalation, about Maria Santos' son, afraid to be alone, about Janet Williams, reliving trauma every time she heard sirens. "I think the truth has a way of winning eventually, sweetheart." And today, the truth got a lot stronger. As Marcus turned off the news and headed to bed, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning in September when Diana Westbrook had told him that property damage was less important than her environmental concerns. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Diana's supporters rallied and federal prosecutors reviewed the evidence. But tonight, for the first time in months, Marcus felt like justice was finally within reach. The morning after the FBI raids, Marcus woke to find his driveway blocked by news vans and reporters. Through his bedroom window, he could see cameras pointed at his house and journalists speaking into microphones with his home as the backdrop. Diana Westbrook supporters had apparently decided that if she was going to be investigated, Marcus should face equal scrutiny. Emma peered out her bedroom window and groaned. Dad, how am I supposed to get to school with all these people out there? Marcus called Chief Rodriguez, who arranged for a police escort to get Emma safely to school through the back streets. As the patrol car pulled away with his daughter, Marcus felt a surge of anger at Diana's supporters for dragging a teenager into their political theater. By 9 a.m., Agent Kim was at Marcus's office with updates that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The evidence we seized yesterday is even more damaging than we initially thought, she said, spreading documents across his desk. Diana wasn't just targeting working-class neighborhoods randomly. She was using sophisticated demographic analysis to identify communities with the least political power to fight back. Agent Kim showed Marcus spreadsheets that Diana had created, analyzing everything from average income and education levels to voting patterns and rates of civic participation. Communities with higher concentrations of immigrants, elderly residents, or single-parent households were specifically flagged as optimal impact zones. She was essentially redlining for protest targeting, Agent Kim explained. The same communities that have historically been denied services were being systematically targeted for service disruption. The federal investigation was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. By noon, U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had scheduled a press conference to announce formal charges against Diana Westbrook and Riverside Environmental Action. Meanwhile, Diana's public relations strategy was beginning to backfire spectacularly. Her continued live streams from her luxury home, surrounded by expensive artwork and designer furniture, created an uncomfortable contrast with her claims of being a persecuted activist. Social media users began posting side-by-side images of Diana's mansion and the modest homes and neighborhoods where REA protests had delayed emergency services. The turning point came when Marcus's phone rang with an unexpected call. Mr. Chen, this is Councilwoman Rebecca Torres. I think we need to talk. Councilwoman Torres represented the district that included most of the neighborhoods where REA protests had caused emergency delays. She was also one of the few city council members who hadn't immediately rallied to Diana's defense when the FBI investigation became public. Councilwoman Torres, what can I do for you? I've been reviewing the data that Mr. Patterson presented yesterday, and I have some questions. Can you meet me in my office this afternoon? Marcus arrived at City Hall to find Councilwoman Torres waiting with maps, charts, and a laptop computer. A Latina woman in her 40s who had worked her way up from community organizer to elected official. She had the focused intensity of someone who'd spent her career fighting for underrepresented communities. Mr. Chen, I need to understand something, she said without preamble. The neighborhoods where these protest delays occurred, they're the same neighborhoods that consistently receive slower emergency response times anyway. Is that coincidental? Marcus studied the maps she'd prepared. I don't think it's coincidental at all. Diana Westbrook was exploiting existing inequalities in emergency services. That's what I was afraid of. Councilwoman Torres pulled up demographic data on her laptop. These communities already face longer ambulance response times, older fire equipment, and fewer police patrols. Diana's protests were adding delays to areas that were already underserved. She was targeting the most vulnerable communities precisely because they were vulnerable. Exactly. And when those communities complained about the delays, they didn't have the political connections or resources to get anyone to listen. Councilwoman Torres leaned back in her chair. Mr. Chen, I owe you an apology. When this controversy first started, I assumed you were just another city employee who didn't understand the importance of protest rights. I was wrong. That afternoon's U.S. Attorney press conference was devastating for Diana's cause. Standing behind a podium flanked by FBI agents and civil rights attorneys, Jennifer Walsh laid out charges that went far beyond simple interference with emergency services. Diana Westbrook and Riverside Environmental Action are being charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights, specifically the systematic denial of equal access to emergency services based on racial and economic demographics, Walsh announced. The evidence shows a deliberate pattern of targeting minority and working-class communities while avoiding disruption in affluent areas. Walsh displayed the same demographic maps that Marcus and Robert had created, but now backed by federal authority and criminal charges. This case represents a new form of discrimination, using the guise of environmental activism to deny essential services to vulnerable communities. The most serious charge was conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, which carried potential sentences of up to 10 years in prison. Additional charges included tax fraud related to the Westbrook Foundation's misrepresentation of its activities and multiple counts of interfering with emergency services. Diana's response was immediate and desperate. She held her own press conference outside REA's offices, surrounded by a smaller group of supporters than usual. Her message had shifted from claims of persecution to outright denial of the evidence. These charges are based on manufactured evidence and selective prosecution, Diana declared. The federal government is criminalizing environmental activism because we dared to challenge corporate power. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Diana's credibility was crumbling. Local investigative reporters had begun examining her claims more critically, discovering that many of her statements about government persecution were contradicted by public records. The most damaging revelation came from Channel 7's investigative team, which obtained security camera footage from several of Diana's protests. The footage showed REA protesters deliberately positioning themselves to block emergency vehicle access points, then quickly moving when cameras were pointed in their direction. This isn't spontaneous civil disobedience, the news report explained. This is calculated disruption designed to cause maximum interference while avoiding accountability. Emma's science fair presentation that evening provided an unexpected coda to the day's events. Standing before a panel of judges and an audience that included several parents whose children attended school with Emma, she presented her analysis of emergency response delays with the confidence of someone who had lived through the consequences she was documenting. Emergency services exist to protect everyone equally, Emma concluded her presentation. When any group systematically blocks that access for political purposes, they're not fighting for justice. They're creating a new form of injustice. The judges were impressed, but Marcus was more proud of the strength his daughter had shown in turning a traumatic experience into a learning opportunity. As they drove home through streets that were finally free of news vans and protesters, Emma asked the question that had been weighing on Marcus's mind. "Dad, do you think the charges will actually stick? Will she really go to prison?" Marcus thought about the spreadsheets showing demographic targeting, the emails discussing strategic community selection, and the testimony of victims whose lives had been endangered by Diana's calculated disruptions. "Emma, I've learned that justice doesn't always happen quickly, but when you have truth, evidence, and victims willing to speak up, it usually happens eventually." Diana Westbrook spent years targeting people who couldn't fight back. But she made the mistake of thinking no one was paying attention. And you were paying attention. I was paying attention. And more importantly, I was documenting everything. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus noticed that someone had cleaned the graffiti off his garage door and left a small bouquet of flowers by the front steps. A note was attached. "Thank you for standing up for our community. The Santos family." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Marcus felt like they were finally coming home. 6 months after the FBI raids, Marcus sat in the federal courthouse watching Diana Westbrook's attorney make one final, desperate argument to the jury. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, and every day had brought new revelations about the systematic nature of REA's discriminatory targeting. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors had displayed Diana's demographic spreadsheets on courtroom monitors, showing how she had categorized neighborhoods by income, race, and political vulnerability. Email chains revealed discussions about maximizing disruption in areas with minimal resistance capacity and protecting donor neighborhoods from operational impact. Most damaging were the recordings made by the FBI's confidential source within REA. In meeting after meeting, Diana could be heard explicitly discussing how to target communities that lacked the resources to mount legal challenges while avoiding areas where supporters and donors might be inconvenienced. Marcus had testified on the 3rd day of the trial, presenting his documentation of 47 separate incidents where REA protest had delayed emergency services. His military bearing and methodical presentation of evidence had clearly impressed the jury, particularly when he described finding Mrs. Patterson unconscious from smoke inhalation. Mr. Chen, the prosecutor had asked, in your professional opinion, were these delays the result of coincidental conflicts between protests and emergency responses? No, Marcus replied firmly. The pattern was too consistent and too geographically specific to be coincidental. Emergency routes were being deliberately targeted during peak response hours. Diana's defense attorney had tried to paint Marcus as a vindictive bureaucrat who couldn't tolerate criticism, but the strategy backfired when Robert Patterson presented victim impact statements from 17 families affected by RE-related delays. Maria Santos had been particularly compelling when she described her son's diabetic emergency. The paramedics told me that if they'd been delayed even 5 more minutes, my child could have died, she testified, her voice breaking. How is that environmental activism? How is endangering children protecting anyone? Janet Williams's testimony about being trapped with her abusive ex-husband while police were delayed by REA protests had visibly affected several jurors. 8 minutes doesn't sound like long, but when someone is threatening to kill you and help can't get through because of protesters, 8 minutes feels like 8 hours. The prosecution's case was bolstered by expert testimony from Dr. Patricia Henderson, a professor of emergency management at the State University. She had analyzed REA's protest patterns and concluded that the targeting showed sophisticated understanding of emergency service infrastructure combined with deliberate exploitation of systemic inequalities. The defendant didn't just interfere with emergency services, Dr. Henderson testified. She weaponized existing disparities to maximize harm to vulnerable communities while protecting privileged areas where her supporters lived. Diana's defense had tried to argue that environmental activism sometimes required disruptive tactics, and that any delays were unintentional consequences of legitimate protest. But the demographic evidence was too clear and the recorded conversations too explicit. The most devastating moment came when the prosecution played a recording of Diana telling other REA organizers, "We need to focus our actions on communities that can't fight back politically. Working-class neighborhoods, immigrant communities, areas with high elderly populations. These are optimal impact zones because residents lack the resources to mount sustained opposition." When Diana took the stand in her own defense, her testimony only made things worse. Under cross-examination, she became defensive and evasive, particularly when confronted with the spreadsheets tracking neighborhood demographics. Ms. Westbrook, the prosecutor asked, "Can you explain why your organization maintained detailed files on the racial composition and income levels of targeted neighborhoods?" "We needed to understand the communities where we were working," Diana replied, but her answer sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. "And why did your organization never stage protests in affluent neighborhoods like Riverside Heights, where you yourself live?" Diana's pause was telling. "Our actions were focused on areas where development pressure was most intense. Areas that coincidentally happened to be 89% below median income and 67% minority populations. I don't see race when I'm fighting for environmental justice." The prosecutor's response was swift, but your own documents show that you absolutely saw race, income, and demographic vulnerability when choosing protest locations. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: conspiracy to violate civil rights, systematic interference with emergency services, and tax fraud related to the Westbrook Foundation's misrepresentation of activities. When the verdicts were read, Diana showed no emotion, but her supporters in the courtroom gasped audibly. Several began crying, apparently genuinely shocked that their environmental hero had been convicted of civil rights violations. Judge Patricia Morrison scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, but indicated that the severity of the charges and the systematic nature of the violations would result in significant prison time. Outside the courthouse, U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh addressed the media with a statement that had clearly been prepared for this moment. "Today's verdict sends a clear message that civil rights violations will not be tolerated, regardless of the political motivation behind them," Walsh announced. "Environmental activism, like all forms of political expression, is protected by the First Amendment. But systematically denying emergency services to vulnerable communities is not activism. It's discrimination. Marcus declined interviews, but Robert Patterson spoke eloquently about what the verdict meant for the affected communities. This case was never about silencing environmental activism, Robert told reporters. It was about ensuring that all communities have equal access to emergency services, regardless of their economic status or political power. The civil lawsuits followed quickly. Within weeks of the criminal conviction, 17 families had filed federal civil rights claims against Diana, personally, and the Westbrook Foundation. The lawsuits sought both monetary damages and injunctive relief to prevent similar targeting in the future. Marcus learned from Robert that Diana's financial situation had become precarious. Legal fees had exhausted much of her trust fund, and the Westbrook Foundation was facing IRS penalties that could result in loss of tax-exempt status. Several of her luxury properties were being liquidated to cover mounting legal costs. The sentencing hearing drew a packed courtroom. Judge Morrison had clearly studied the case thoroughly, and her comments from the bench were scathing. Ms. Westbrook, you have systematically exploited the very communities that environmental justice movements are supposed to protect, Judge Morrison said. You used sophisticated analysis to identify vulnerable populations, then deliberately denied them access to emergency services while protecting affluent areas where your supporters lived. The judge paused, looking directly at Diana. This represents a profound betrayal of the principles you claim to champion. Environmental justice cannot be achieved by creating new forms of injustice. Diana received 8 years in federal prison on the civil rights charges, plus additional time for tax fraud. The sentences would run concurrently, but she would serve a minimum of 6 years before being eligible for parole. As Diana was led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the process had revealed something troubling about how easily political movements could be corrupted by privilege and power. That evening, Marcus and Emma attended a community meeting in the neighborhood where Mrs. Patterson lived. The purpose was to establish new protocols ensuring that emergency vehicle access would never again be compromised by protest activities. Mrs. Patterson, now recovered from her injuries but still using supplemental oxygen, spoke to the gathered residents with a voice that was soft but determined. I don't want anyone to think I'm against people fighting for what they believe in, she said. But when I was lying on my kitchen floor, breathing smoke and waiting for help that couldn't get through, I wasn't thinking about environmental justice or political movements. I was thinking about my grandchildren and whether I'd ever see them again. She paused, looking around the room. We can protect the environment and protect each other at the same time. But that means making sure everyone has equal access to help when they need it most. As Marcus drove home that night, Emma was quiet for several minutes before speaking. Dad, do you think Diana Westbrook really believed she was helping people? Marcus considered the question carefully. I think she started with good intentions, sweetheart. But somewhere along the way, she began to believe that her cause was so important that other people's safety didn't matter. That's how good people sometimes end up doing terrible things. How do you make sure that doesn't happen to you? By remembering that the moment you think your cause justifies hurting innocent people, you stop being the good guy in the story. 1 year after Diana Westbrook's conviction, Marcus stood before the city council presenting the Emergency Access Protection Act, legislation that had grown out of the REA case and was now being considered by municipalities across the country. The council chambers were packed, but the atmosphere was markedly different from the hostile meetings during the height of the Diana controversy. The Emergency Access Protection Act establishes clear guidelines for protest activities while preserving First Amendment rights, Marcus explained to the council. The key principle is that emergency vehicle routes must remain accessible at all times, with designated protest coordinators responsible for ensuring immediate access when needed. Councilwoman Torres, who had become a strong advocate for the legislation, nodded approvingly. Mr. Chen, can you explain how this differs from previous approaches to managing protests? Previous policies were reactive. We waited for conflicts to develop, then try to resolve them. This approach is proactive. Protest organizers work with emergency services during the planning phase to identify routes and timing that allow for legitimate demonstration while maintaining emergency access. The legislation had been developed with input from civil liberties organizations, emergency responders, and community activists who understood that protecting emergency access actually strengthened rather than weakened democratic protest rights. Dr. Michael Rivera, representing the local ACLU chapter, spoke in support of the legislation. Free speech is most effective when it's sustainable and responsible. The Emergency Access Protection Act preserves the right to demonstrate while ensuring that protests don't inadvertently harm the very communities activists are trying to help. The most compelling testimony came from Maria Santos, whose son's diabetic emergency had been delayed by REA protests. She had become an advocate for emergency access protection, speaking at conferences and helping draft similar legislation in other cities. "I believe in the right to protest," Maria told the council. "But I also believe in the right of my child to receive emergency medical care without delay. These rights don't have to be in conflict if we plan responsibly." The legislation passed unanimously, with several council members noting that it represented a new model for balancing civil liberties with public safety. Within months, similar laws were being adopted in cities across 3 states, with Marcus serving as a consultant to help other municipalities implement effective emergency access protocols. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuits against Diana and the Westbrook Foundation were being resolved through a settlement process that Robert Patterson had orchestrated. Rather than simply seeking monetary damages, the affected families had negotiated for systemic changes that would prevent similar targeting in the future. The settlement established a fund for emergency response improvements in the communities that had been targeted by REA protests. New equipment, additional training, and enhanced communication systems were being implemented specifically in neighborhoods that had experienced delays. "We wanted to make sure something positive came out of this terrible situation," Robert explained to Marcus as they reviewed the settlement documents. "The money Diana is paying isn't just compensation for harm. It's investment in making these communities more resilient." The settlement also required the dissolution of the Westbrook Foundation and the establishment of new oversight mechanisms for any future charitable organizations focused on environmental activism. The goal was to prevent the kind of financial opacity that had allowed Diana to fund discriminatory activities while claiming tax exemptions for charitable work. Emma had become something of a local celebrity following her science fair victory and subsequent presentations about emergency response systems. She was now a senior in high school, planning to study public policy and emergency management in college. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I want to do after graduation," Emma said over dinner one evening. "I want to study how to make systems work better for everyone, not just people with money and connections." Marcus felt a surge of pride. His daughter had taken their traumatic experience and transformed it into a calling for public service. "That's exactly what the world needs, sweetheart. People who understand how systems can be fixed rather than just criticized. I've been researching emergency management programs, and I found something interesting. There's a whole field called equity in emergency services that focuses on making sure all communities get equal protection." "Tell me more about that." "Well, it turns out that what Diana was doing, targeting vulnerable communities, is actually the reverse of what emergency management is supposed to do. The field is supposed to focus extra resources on communities that are most at risk, not exploit their vulnerabilities." Emma had been accepted to the State University's Emergency Management Program with a full scholarship, funded partly by the Victim Impact Settlement from the Diana case. Her experiences had given her insights that impressed admissions counselors and professors who recognized her unique perspective on the intersection of civil rights and emergency services. The transformation in their community had been remarkable. Mrs. Patterson, now fully recovered, had become a leader in the neighborhood emergency preparedness program that Marcus had helped establish. The program trained residents in basic emergency response skills, while creating communication networks that ensured emergency services could reach anyone who needed help. "The ironic thing," Mrs. Patterson told Marcus during one of their monthly coffee meetings, is that we're probably better prepared for emergencies now than we were before Diana started causing problems. Her actions forced us to think systematically about emergency access in ways we never had before. The Emergency Preparedness Program had become a model for other communities, with delegations visiting from cities dealing with similar conflicts between activism and emergency access. Marcus found himself traveling frequently to speak at conferences about balancing civil liberties with public safety. At one conference in Denver, Marcus met Captain Sarah Mitchell, an emergency management coordinator who had been dealing with similar activist-related delays in her city. "Your documentation approach has been incredibly helpful," she told him. "We've started using your protocols to identify patterns before they become crises. The key is treating documentation as problem-solving rather than evidence-gathering," Marcus replied. "When you focus on understanding systems and patterns, you can often prevent conflicts rather than just react to them." "Have you heard anything about Diana Westbrook lately?" Marcus nodded grimly. "She's been trying to organize other inmates around prison reform issues, but from what I understand, her approach hasn't changed much. She's still focused on confrontation rather than collaboration." The most significant long-term change had been in local emergency services themselves. Chief Rodriguez had used the REA case to advocate for increased funding and improved equipment, particularly in neighborhoods that have been targeted by protests. "Marcus, your work on this case has helped us secure funding for 3 new ambulances and upgraded communication equipment for the entire department," Chief Rodriguez told him during his annual performance review. "But more importantly, you've helped us think more systematically about equity in emergency services." Marcus had been promoted to Regional Emergency Management Coordinator, with responsibility for developing protocols that other cities could adopt. His work was being recognized nationally, with invitations to speak at conferences and contribute to policy papers about emergency access protection. But the recognition that meant the most came from the families who had been affected by REA's targeting. At the 1-year anniversary of Diana's conviction, they gathered at the community center for what had become an annual emergency preparedness fair. Janet Williams, the domestic violence survivor whose police response had been delayed, now volunteered with an organization that helped other survivors develop safety plans that included emergency communication protocols. "What Marcus taught us," Janet told the gathered crowd, "is that protecting vulnerable people requires planning, not just good intentions." Diana claimed to be fighting for justice, but she never bothered to understand how her actions affected the people she was claiming to help. As Marcus looked around the room at families learning CPR, children practicing how to call for help, and neighbors exchanging emergency contact information, he realized that something genuinely positive had emerged from their ordeal. Diana Westbrook had tried to exploit community vulnerabilities for political theater, but the response to her actions had been to strengthen those same communities, making them more resilient and better protected than they had ever been before. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the best response to someone trying to break a system is to build a better one. 5 years after Diana Westbrook's conviction, Marcus stood at the podium of the National Emergency Management Conference in Washington, D.C., delivering the keynote address to an audience of over 800 emergency responders, policymakers, and civil rights advocates. The title of his presentation was "When Civil Rights and Emergency Services Align: Building Equitable Response Systems." 5 years ago, I was just a local emergency coordinator dealing with what seemed like a simple problem: protesters blocking fire trucks. Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. Today, the principles we developed in response to that crisis are being implemented in over 200 cities across the country. The audience included people whose lives have been touched by the reforms that grew out of the Diana Westbrook case. Dr. Patricia Henderson, the emergency management expert who had testified at Diana's trial, was now directing a federal grant program that helped communities implement equitable emergency response protocols. Agent Sarah Kim had left the FBI to work for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, where she specialized in cases involving discriminatory denial of services. Marcus's presentation focused on the emergency access protection model, which had evolved far beyond its origins as a response to Diana's targeting. The model now addressed broader issues of equity in emergency services, helping communities identify and address disparities in response times, resource allocation, and service quality. The Diana Westbrook case taught us that civil rights violations can take forms we didn't expect, Marcus explained to the audience. But it also taught us that protecting emergency access for vulnerable communities actually strengthens emergency services for everyone. In the audience, Marcus could see Emma, now a senior at the State University, majoring in public policy with a focus on emergency management. She had spent the summer interning with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, working on a research project that examined how natural disasters disproportionately affected communities that already faced emergency service disparities. Dad's work showed that emergency access isn't just about having ambulances and fire trucks, Emma had explained to her FEMA supervisors. It's about making sure those services reach everyone equally, regardless of their neighborhood's income level or political power. Emma's internship research had identified patterns similar to what Diana had exploited. Communities with limited political resources often received slower emergency response times, even without deliberate interference. Her recommendations for addressing these disparities were being incorporated into federal emergency management guidelines. After Marcus's presentation, he was approached by Dr. Michael Chen, no relation, a researcher from UCLA who had been studying the long-term impacts of the emergency access protection model. Mr. Chen, our data shows something remarkable, Dr. Chen said, showing Marcus graphs on his tablet. Cities that have implemented your protocols haven't just eliminated protest-related delays. They've improved overall emergency response times by an average of 12%. How is that possible? The systematic approach to identifying and protecting emergency routes has forced cities to examine their entire response infrastructure. They're finding and fixing inefficiencies that existed long before anyone was blocking roads. The research confirmed what Marcus had suspected, that addressing Diana's targeting had revealed broader problems in emergency service delivery. Cities implementing the emergency access protection model were discovering that their response systems had been inadvertently discriminatory, with faster response times in affluent areas and slower times in working-class neighborhoods. It's like Diana's actions forced us to hold up a mirror to our entire emergency response system, Dr. Chen explained. And when cities saw the disparities, they couldn't ignore them anymore. The conference also featured a panel discussion that included several people whose lives had been affected by the original REA case. Maria Santos, whose son's diabetic emergency had been delayed, was now working as a patient advocate specializing in emergency medical access for chronic disease patients. The delay that almost killed my son led to changes that have probably saved hundreds of other children, Maria told the panel audience. That's not justice exactly, but it's something meaningful. Robert Patterson had left his law practice to establish the Emergency Access Legal Center, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to communities facing discriminatory emergency service delivery. The center had handled over 60 cases in 5 years, using legal strategies developed during Diana's prosecution. The Westbrook case established important precedents about civil rights and emergency services, Robert explained to the panel. But more importantly, it showed that systematic documentation and legal action can create positive change for entire communities. Even Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but still sharp and active, had traveled to Washington for the conference. She had become something of a celebrity in emergency management circles, speaking about the importance of community preparedness and the impact of delayed response times on vulnerable populations. I never thought that lying on my kitchen floor, breathing smoke, would lead to all this, Mrs. Patterson told the audience during the panel. But I'm grateful that something good came from something so frightening. The panel discussion also addressed the question that many people have been wondering about. What had happened to Diana Westbrook herself? Agent Kim, now working for the Department of Justice, provided an update. Diana Westbrook was released from federal prison 8 months ago after serving 4 years of her sentence. She's currently working for minimum wage at a nonprofit organization focused on prison reform, and she's prohibited from organizing protests or serving in leadership roles of activist organizations as part of her parole conditions. Has she expressed any remorse for her actions? A conference attendee asked. Not publicly, Agent Kim replied. From what we understand, she continues to view herself as a victim of government persecution rather than someone who violated other people's civil rights. That evening, Marcus attended a reception where he was honored with the National Emergency Management Association's Distinguished Service Award. The citation read, "For innovative leadership in developing equitable emergency response systems and for demonstrating that civil rights protection strengthens rather than weakens emergency services." Emma accompanied him to the award ceremony, and as they posed for photos, Marcus reflected on how much their lives had changed since that morning when Diana had told him that property damage was less important than her environmental concerns. "Dad, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you just ignored Diana's protests and focused on your job?" Emma asked as they walked back to their hotel. Marcus considered the question. "I think about that sometimes. But then I remember Mrs. Patterson in the hospital, and Maria's son almost going into a coma, and Janet Williams trapped with her abusive ex-husband. Ignoring the problem wouldn't have made it go away. It would have just allowed more people to get hurt. Do you think Diana will ever understand what she did wrong?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but I've learned that you can't wait for bad people to become good people before you start protecting the people they're hurting." As they reached their hotel, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Chief Rodriguez back home. "Saw your speech on the live stream. The entire department is proud of you. Also, Mrs. Patterson wanted me to tell you that her new great-granddaughter is going to be named Marcella, after the man who saved her grandmother's life." Marcus smiled, thinking about how a crisis that had started with block fire trucks and personal harassment had evolved into a national movement for emergency service equity. Sometimes the most important victories weren't about defeating the people who caused problems. They were about building systems that prevented similar problems from happening to anyone else. Diana Westbrook had tried to use her privilege to target vulnerable communities, but the response to her actions had been to strengthen those communities and create protections that ensured equal access to emergency services for everyone. That, Marcus reflected, was what real justice looked like. 10 years after Diana Westbrook first blocked emergency vehicles on Maple Street, Marcus Chen sat in his office as Regional Emergency Management Director, reviewing a situation report that would have seemed impossible during those dark months of harassment and delays. The report detailed a large environmental protest plan for downtown, but this time, the organizers had worked closely with emergency services to ensure ambulance and fire truck access would remain unimpeded throughout the demonstration. The Riverside Climate Action Coalition has submitted detailed route maps and established communication protocols with our dispatch center, his assistant, Jennifer, explained as she handed him the coordination paperwork. They've also designated marshals specifically responsible for maintaining emergency vehicle corridors. Marcus smiled as he reviewed the documents. This was how the system was supposed to work, passionate advocacy balanced with responsibility for community safety. The protesters were fighting for environmental protection, but they understood that protecting the environment meant protecting the people who lived in it. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now Dr. Emma Chen, who had just completed her PhD in emergency management and public policy. She was working for the Federal Emergency Management Agency in Washington, developing national guidelines for equitable emergency response systems. "Dad, just finished presenting our new federal standards to Congress. The Diana Westbrook case is now part of official federal emergency management curriculum. Your documentation approach is being taught to emergency coordinators across the country." Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had started as a local crisis had evolved into national policy that protected vulnerable communities from discriminatory targeting while preserving legitimate protest rights. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Patterson, now 85 but still active in community emergency preparedness, stood in his doorway, holding a manila folder and wearing the determined expression he'd come to associate with her advocacy work. "Marcus, I hope you have a few minutes," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I wanted to update you on the scholarship program." The Rachel Patterson Emergency Access Scholarship, named after Mrs. Patterson's daughter, who had died in a car accident years before the Diana incident, had been funding emergency management education for students from underrepresented communities. In 10 years, the program had supported 43 students through college and graduate school. This year's recipient is particularly special, Mrs. Patterson explained, opening her folder. Her name is Sofia Gonzalez, and she's the daughter of Maria Santos. Marcus looked up in surprise. Maria's daughter? The family whose son almost went into diabetic coma. The same family. Sophia was 12 when her brother's emergency was delayed by Diana's protest. She's been interested in emergency medical services ever since. She's starting her paramedic training next month, with plans to eventually become an emergency management coordinator. Mrs. Patterson handed Marcus a photo of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, smiling broadly. She wrote in her scholarship application that she wants to make sure no family goes through what hers experienced. That's incredible. How is her brother doing? Miguel is doing well. He's actually working as a diabetes educator now, teaching other kids how to manage their condition and when to call for emergency help. The whole family has turned their trauma into service to others. As Mrs. Patterson left, Marcus reflected on how many lives had been changed by the events that began with Diana's blocked fire truck. Not just the immediate victims, but entire communities that were now better prepared for emergencies and better protected from discriminatory targeting. His computer chimed with an email from Robert Patterson, who had just been appointed to the Federal Civil Rights Commission. Robert was writing to inform Marcus that the Department of Justice was releasing a 10-year report on the Diana Westbrook case and its impact on civil rights enforcement. Marcus, the email read, the DOJ report credits our case with establishing new precedents for protecting equal access to emergency services. More importantly, it's led to proactive enforcement that has prevented similar targeting in dozens of other cities. The systematic documentation approach you developed is now standard protocol for civil rights investigations involving public services. Marcus opened the DOJ report, which included a section titled From Crisis to Reform: How Local Documentation Changed National Policy. The report detailed how the evidence-gathering techniques Marcus had used were now being taught at FBI training academies and had been applied to cases involving discriminatory policing, unequal school funding, and biased housing enforcement. The report also included an update on Diana Westbrook herself. After her release from prison, she had worked briefly for a prison reform organization but had been dismissed after attempting to organize confrontational protests that violated her parole conditions. She was currently unemployed and facing ongoing civil litigation from victims who continued to experience financial and medical consequences from the emergency delays she had caused. Diana Westbrook's case serves as a cautionary tale, the report concluded, demonstrating how political activism, when disconnected from accountability and empathy, can become a form of discrimination disguised as social justice. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the cemetery where his wife Rachel was buried. It had become his tradition to visit her grave on the anniversary of Diana's first block fire truck, sharing updates about Emma's career and the continuing impact of their work. Emma got the promotion to Deputy Director of Emergency Equity, he told Rachel's headstone, adjusting the fresh flowers he'd brought. She's going to be responsible for implementing emergency access protections in every state. I think you'd be proud of how she's turned something so painful into a way to help others. As he sat quietly in the cemetery, Marcus's phone rang. It was Emma, calling from Washington with excitement in her voice. Dad, you'll never guess what just happened. I just got off a call with emergency management directors from Germany and Canada. They want to implement the emergency access protection model in their countries. Your documentation approach is going international. That's wonderful, sweetheart. But what matters most is that it's working. Our community's safer. Absolutely. The data shows that cities using our protocols have not only eliminated protest-related delays, they've improved overall emergency response times and reduced disparities between different neighborhoods. We're saving lives, Dad. After hanging up, Marcus walked back to his car, thinking about the conversation he'd had with Diana Westbrook that first morning when she'd told him property damage was less important than her environmental concerns. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd also been wrong about something more fundamental. She believed that her cause justified harming innocent people. The real lesson of the Diana Westbrook case wasn't about protests or emergency services or even civil rights. It was about the responsibility that comes with power, whether that power comes from wealth, political connections, or simply the ability to organize other people. Diana had used her privilege to target communities that couldn't fight back, believing that her environmental goals justified the means she used to achieve them. But sustainable change, Marcus had learned, came from building systems that protected everyone equally, not from exploiting the vulnerable to pressure the powerful. As he drove home through streets where emergency vehicles could now respond without delay to any neighborhood, regardless of its residents' income or political influence, Marcus thought about advice he would give to anyone facing similar challenges. Document everything. Build coalitions with other affected people. Work within the system while building evidence for systemic change. Focus on protecting victims rather than punishing perpetrators. And most importantly, remember that justice isn't about winning individual battles. It's about building systems where those battles don't need to be fought. Diana Westbrook had tried to silence opposition through intimidation and harassment. But the response to her actions had been to create transparency, accountability, and equal protection that made similar targeting impossible. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't stopping the wrong. It's building a system where the wrong can't happen again. And if you're dealing with activists who think their cause justifies endangering lives, remember, the most effective response isn't louder shouting. It's quieter documentation and the patience to let consequences arrive through proper channels. The system works, but only when good people make it work.